this is where we're up to with our series so far. So we're over halfway, and today we're looking at the topic of the boy. Okay, you might be thinking, who is that? Some of you might have some suspicions, but the title of this message is "What Will You Bring to Jesus?" And it's very much going to be a continuation of what we've already seen up the front here today. At church camp last year, I shared the story of Dwight Moody. Okay, now some of you were there who would have heard this already, but a lot of you weren't, so I thought I'd share this story with you again. Dwight Moody was one of the great evangelists of the 19th century. He began his life from very humble beginnings. His father was a bricklayer, and at the age of only 4, his father passed away, and that left his mother, who was pregnant with twins, to look after the family, and adding those two to the family, that was 9 kids that she had to look after. So this was a family of very real struggle and challenging circumstances that they had. Dwight Moody, he attended school, but he didn't get more than about a 5th grade worth of education. And at the age of 17, he left school and he went and worked with his uncle in a shop selling shoes. He was a hard, enthusiastic worker, and he really excelled in this role of making and selling these shoes. Now soon he moved to Chicago, and at Chicago he had the dream of amassing a great wealth, a great fortune for himself. He wanted to make $100,000, which in the 19th century was an awful lot of money, and this was his great ambition in life. Now around the same time, Dwight Moody had started to attend church. His uncle said that he can come and work with him as long as he goes along with him to church as well. So Dwight Moody started going along to church, and it was at Sunday school at that church where he discovered the love of God, and he had this very genuine conversion experience. Now, it slowly dawned on him that he has one part of his life is following Jesus and wanting to serve him, but it started to dawn upon him that there was a bit of a conflict between his desire to spend all his time and energy amassing this great fortune for himself and his desire to serve God. And he realized that he needed to really focus on the serving God aspect of it. So he left his business and he started a Sunday school in the slums of Chicago, helping some of the very poorest people of the community in social work as well as teaching them about Jesus. Now, this Sunday school blossomed into a church, and he was very innovative in the way that he got people to come along. For adults, he ran English classes, and that's how he got adults to be connected with his church. And for the kids, he offered them candy and pony rides. And together, that was the perfect combination. He had many kids coming along to him to get those candy and pony rides at this church of his. Now, in 1871, there was a huge fire that went through Chicago, and it devastated it burnt down it destroyed his church and his home and much of Chicago, I believe, as well at the time. And so he went off to New York to raise some funds for the rebuilding of this church. And while he was walking down the street in New York, he was suddenly stopped in his tracks by this impression from God that was unlike anything he had experienced before. And he went back and he was sensing that God was leading him not just to focus so much on the social work, but for him in particular, God had given him the calling to focus his efforts in evangelism, in sharing the good news of Jesus with others. So he got back to Chicago, and his new vision was the evangelism of the world in this generation. Isn't that a great vision? The evangelism of the world in this generation. Now he continued to innovate. He perfected the art of evangelism, door knocking, the way he fundraised through businesses. He would have a gospel soloist who would come up and lead out in his programs. Large central halls in towns that he went to. He really perfected the art. And for example, in one time in Chicago, the city decided to run a fair on Sunday. And for them, that was their Sabbath. And some of the leaders, other church leaders, wanted to boycott this fair. And he said, no, let's instead, this was his words, let us open so many preaching places and present the gospel so attractively that people will want to come and hear it. So he competed with the fair. And as a result of that, in one single day, 130,000 people listened to the preaching events that took place around in Chicago in one day. Now, he went on to be a famous preacher throughout Europe and America, and it's estimated that throughout his lifetime that over 100 million people heard Dwight Moody preach. And you think this is before the internet, before TV, before all those things. This is 100 million people literally sitting there and listening to this man. Now, the thing that stands out to me, the thing that really stood out to me as I went through and I researched Dwight Moody's story was how unlikely of a person he was to have this sort of success. Let me share with you. So when he first was converted at the church he went to during Sunday school, this was his Sunday school teacher's reflections on Dwight Moody at that time. The person said, "I think that the committee of the Mount Vernon Church seldom met an applicant for membership more unlikely ever to become a Christian of clear and decided views of gospel truth, still less to fill any extended sphere of public usefulness." How's that for an encouraging Sabbath Sunday school teacher? And this wasn't the only person that tried to discourage Dwight Moody. When he first rose to preach, so he'd hired a hall and... it was during prayer meeting. So having prayer meeting, the first time he got up the front to preach. This is what one of the deacons, and we've just ordained our deacons and deaconesses. Let's hope this never happens from them. This is what someone said to Dwight Moody. "In my opinion, you would best serve God by keeping still." Not very encouraging. Now, after he became a famous evangelist, this is what Dwight Moody had to say about himself. He said, "I know perfectly well that wherever I go and preach, there are many better preachers than I am. All that I can say about it is that the Lord uses me." Okay? All that I can say is that the Lord uses me. Now, my favorite story was when, in his very early days, he had hired a hall and he had filled the pews with people ready to hear Dwight Moody preach. And early on, and a critic came up to him, he commended his zeal, but he told him that he needed to realize his limitations and he needed to not attempt to speak in public. The critic said, "You make too many mistakes in grammar." And I loved Dwight's response. Dwight replied, "I know I make mistakes and I lack a great many things, but I'm doing the best with what..." Sorry, that should say got there. Sorry. The best I've got. "I'm doing the best with what I've got." The critic said, don't get too distracted by that. This is the point here. And then Dwight Moody paused and looked at the man searchingly and said, "Look here, friend, you've got grammar enough. What are you doing with it for your master?" Okay, what a great answer that was. What are you doing with it for your master? I remind you of our question we're looking at. What will you bring to Jesus? What will you bring to Jesus? For Dwight Moody, he brought his 5th grade education. He brought his poor grammar. He brought his time, his enthusiasm, his energy, his life. He brought his whole life to Jesus, and it changed the world for so many people. What will you bring to Jesus? When we bring what we have to Jesus, when we lay it down at his feet, seeking his blessing, incredible things will happen. Turn with me in your Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And we're starting in verse 30. Mark chapter 6 and verse 30. It says, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves.'" So here we see the 12 disciples have been sent out to preach, and they come back, they have all these stories, but they're tired. And also at the same time as well, Jesus has just found out that John the Baptist has had his head chopped off. Okay, so there's a lot of very emotional things that are taking place here. And Jesus says, "Let's get aside and let's rest for a while." But we're working at a pace that if we continue at this, we're not even able to eat at the moment. We need to have some time to rest and to recover so we don't burn out. Verse 33. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So here's this situation. Jesus is trying to get by himself, and he hops in the boat with his disciples, goes across the Sea of Galilee, and what does everyone else do? They start running, and they run all the way around the outside. Maybe some of them got on boats, I'm not sure, and then they followed him. But Jesus, he gets to the other side, and it reads as if they get there, and they're like, when will we ever get a break? Okay, there's these people here, but Jesus, it says that he had compassion on them. And the awesome thing about Jesus is he always has time for us. No matter what we're going through, if we have a problem, we want to bring it to Jesus, he will never turn us away. He always has time for us. Verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." I think there's something humorous about this in this story. Later on, we're going to read that there was 5,000 men in this crowd. If you include the women, there's probably something like 20,000 people here. And the disciples, remember, they're tired. They're exhausted, and they look out at the crowd there, and they say, "These people are exhausted. They came running over here. They didn't even prepare anything. They just came straight here. They're hungry. Jesus, let's send them away to go and get some food and to take care of themselves." And Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." What a ridiculous thing for Jesus to ask them to do. How will they ever do this? Verse 37. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of food and give them to eat?" And he said to them, and another way of saying, "Jesus, what you're asking is impossible. There's no way we could possibly feed all of these people." Verse 38. And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples and set them before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. What a beautiful story that this is. I think this is one of my favorite miracles in the story of Jesus. And it shows that no matter what need that we have, Jesus has compassion on us, and Jesus is here to help us with whatever situation that we find ourselves in. Now, I want to remind you that the question we're looking at is, what will you bring to Jesus? And I want to point out that in this story, the people bring 5 different things to Jesus. Okay, 5 different things. The first thing is this. They brought themselves to Jesus. I love their passion. It was a long distance to the other side of the lake. They don't bother to prepare. And in fact, it was almost rude of them. Jesus is trying to get by themselves, and they just don't even care. They're saying, we're just going to put ourselves in front of Jesus because we want a blessing from Jesus. They brought themselves to Jesus. And the first thing that we learn from here is that we need to bring ourselves to Jesus. Continually, we need to come to him and to seek that blessing from him. Number 1. Number 2, they brought their sick to Jesus. Now, in our church, there's a lot of sickness. And ever since I've been here, there's always been a selection of people that are going through sickness, and all of us know people that are sick. And in this story, the people came to Jesus and they brought their sick to him. Let's never stop bringing our sick to Jesus. Jesus has compassion upon sick people who are struggling with illness. And remember, Jesus gets there, he's tired, he's wanting to get by himself, he gets to the other side of the lake, and he looks out on these sick people, and his heart is moved with compassion. They brought their sick to Jesus. Number 3, they brought their challenge to Jesus. Now, at first they didn't bring it to Jesus. The disciples said, send the people away so they can find food for themselves. And Jesus had to sort of work with them, but eventually they brought their challenge to Jesus. 200 denarii wouldn't even feed these people. What's the solution, Jesus? What's the solution to our challenge? And Jesus was able to be the solution to that challenge. And as a church, we have a lot of challenges that we face. We have things like our building project. That's a challenge. But I'd like to suggest that our building challenge is actually a very small compared to the greater challenge that we have. And the challenge that we have is found in Revelation 14, verse 6, where it says, "Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people." This is the challenge that God has given to us. And if we were to go through this whole church and count up all of the gifts, all of the talents, all of the time, all of the skills, and the time that we have to put into this mission of sharing the gospel with our, even just our Central Coast community, and then we had to go around and count all the people up in our community, I tell you what, I think that the situation is a little bit like what we see in this story. Here they are, 5 loaves, 2 fish. They look out at this great crowd of people and they say, what is this for the size of challenge that lies before us? And I'd like to suggest that this is the same situation that we're in as well. We are insufficient for the task that God has given us to go and to preach the everlasting gospel to every nation, tribe, language, and people. But Jesus says, bring your challenge to me. Bring it to me, because with my blessing, we can feed the multitudes. And not just physical bread, but the bread of life, Jesus himself. Number 4, they brought their resources to Jesus. It must have felt so foolish for them to come to Jesus with this great crowd and say, here we go, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. It must have felt absolutely foolish. But they did it in obedience to Jesus, who asked them to do so. And really, it was the boy who brought his fish. In John chapter 6, it says, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they about for so many? It seemed like an absolutely impossible task. But Jesus doesn't ask us to bring everything required for the task. He simply asks us to bring what we have. And they brought what they have, and what we have with Jesus' blessing is enough for the mission that he has set before us. And I believe the greatest faith is required by not by those who have a huge abundance of resources, but the greatest faith is those who have a little amount of resource, and yet they still bring it to Jesus and say, Jesus, I've only got a little, but I want to be a part of the mission that you've given us, and I want to bring this to you, and I'm seeking your blessing as well. Now, this story reminds me, this whole idea of bringing what you have, your limited resources, reminds me of a couple other stories. I think of Moses. Moses was asked, with the burning bush story, Moses was said, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And Moses had all these excuses. He said, who am I? I can't speak very well. What if people don't believe me? Excuse. And this is God's response. It says, then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, this is God's response, what is in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. In other words, give that to me. With just a simple stick, God there in the bush was saying, you give me your stick, and I'm going to give you a great story. I'm going to allow you to bring all these people out of Israel. And it was with that stick that when Moses put that staff out, that the plagues fell upon Egypt. It was with that stick, when he held that stick out, that the Red Sea was parted and the Israelites walked across on dry ground. The Exodus happened with Moses being willing to give what was in his hand to Jesus, that simple stick. He gave, and it was representative of him saying, I give to you what I have. And Jesus said, you give me what you have, and we'll do great things together. What about David? What was his battle he was facing? It was Goliath, this gigantic soldier with this incredibly heavy armor and sword and javelin. And it says in 1 Samuel 17, verse 14, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Little David didn't have very much, but he brought what he had to Jesus. And I love his words of what he said to Goliath. It says, Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." He didn't have much, but he brought to Jesus what he had. And with the blessing of God, he was able to kill Goliath. God doesn't want us to bring lots. He simply wants us to bring what we have. Point number 5, they brought others to Jesus. Now, the person that really comes to mind here is the character of Andrew. Now, I did a little bit of research, and the story of Andrew, I find Andrew doing something in the Gospels 3 times. Okay? 3 times we find Andrew, apart from times where he's just listed amongst the rest of the disciples, where he actually did things in of his own accord. I found 3 situations, and all 3 of them involve him bringing someone to Jesus. Number 1, John chapter 12, verse 20 to 22, it says, "Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' Philip," now remember, these were Gentiles. Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. So Philip's like, "Should we bring these people to Jesus?" Andrew's like, "Let's bring them. Let's bring them to Jesus." The second one, John 1, verse 40 to 42. And I've mentioned this before. One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. And the third time is the one in our story here, John chapter 6. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many?" Andrew was a man who brought people to Jesus, and because of his willingness to bring people to Jesus, we see this great miracle that takes place on this day. So what will you bring to Jesus? They brought themselves to Jesus. They brought their sick to Jesus. They brought their challenge to Jesus. They brought their resources to Jesus, and they brought others to Jesus, and we see this incredible thing that takes place. So my challenge to you is, what will you bring to Jesus? And we're going to finish with a bit of an appeal here. We've got this table up the front, and this table is going to be the place where we bring what we have to Jesus. Now, to start with, I've got on here the cards for the Beautiful God series. For me, I'm the presenter of this series, and as a church, I want to give this to Jesus. I want to give this task to Jesus. So I'm placing this on this table. Now, there's a few other things I have behind the side here. I'm going to grab them and bring them out. And these are representative types of things that people would bring to Jesus based off what we've just looked at. So, number 1, I have a picture of myself in grade 5. Okay? Now, this represents Dwight Moody. He only had a 5th grade education, but he said, "You know what? I'm going to bring that to Jesus." So I'm going to place that here on the table. Secondly, we have some bread. Simple amount of bread. But for this little boy, he said, "You know what? I'm going to bring my bread to Jesus," and we saw amazing things take place. What do you think this one is? Okay, I'm sure Moses' staff looked a bit nicer than this one, but Moses said, "I'm going to give my staff to Jesus. I'm going to give my identity, everything I am, I'm going to give myself to Jesus." And we have the whole story of the Old Testament, the Exodus, incredible things that happen. And here we have, I bought this in Israel, the little sling that David had. There's nothing in it, Megan. You don't have to be too scared there. This is a little sling here, and this for David, he said, "I only have a sling, but I give it to Jesus." And great things took place.